late summer, 1944. The fields of Lorraine shimmer under a haze of heat and dust. Near the French town of Haraucourt, the quiet between artillery barrages feels almost sacred. The war here has become a contest of machines, steel versus steel, design versus endurance. To the Germans, it is the proving ground for their masterpiece, the Panther. Sleek, sloped, and feared, it has come to embody invincibility itself. From the morning mist, a column of Panthers advances, dark silhouettes moving in disciplined formation. Their commanders are confident. Intelligence reports speak of American Shermans scattered and retreating. The air smells of diesel and cordite, of certainty. Then, from behind the hedgerows, the first muzzle flash splits the silence. A single 76mm round crosses the field in less than a heartbeat. It strikes the lead Panther just below the gun mantlet. The impact rings like a hammer against an anvil, and then, impossibly, the armor yields. Flames burst from the turret ring. The crew scrambles out, choking on smoke, faces lit orange by the fire that consumes their machine. The German formation halts in disbelief. For months, they have been told their tanks are untouchable from the front. Yet now, black smoke rises where superiority once stood. Another round finds its mark, then another. Within minutes, 3 Panthers lie burning in the open, their engines still idling as fire eats through the wiring. Across the field, American tank commanders peer through gun sights, scarcely believing what they are seeing. The 70mm Shermans, once dismissed as undergunned, have just shattered the myth that had haunted them since Normandy. The key is not the tank, but the ammunition. Inside each spent shell casing lies a new secret weapon, a small dark projectile stamped with 3 letters, HVAP, high velocity armor piercing. Tungsten cord, faster, denser, deadlier than anything the Germans had imagined. It slices through armor, not by brute force, but by physics, precision over power. As dusk settles over Haraucourt, the smell of burnt oil hangs in the wind. German tankers walk among the wrecks, touching the still hot armor as if to prove it real. The invincible has fallen, not by numbers, not by luck, but by innovation small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. The weapon was new, its effect irreversible. The myth of German armor had begun to fracture, and the age of the tungsten dart had just begun. In 1943, a new shape appeared on the battlefields of the Eastern Front. Low, angular, and unmistakably German. It was called the Panther, and from the moment its treads first cut through the mud of Kursk, the balance of armored warfare seemed to shift. Where other tanks moved, the Panther hunted. Its 75mm high-velocity gun could pierce a Soviet T-34 from 2 kilometers away. Its sloped frontal armor, a direct response to that same Soviet innovation, deflected shells like water. To those who faced it, it felt less like a machine, and more like inevitability made of steel. Reports from the front told of T-34 formations burning in fields they had once dominated. Soviet tank commanders began to speak of it with a tone they rarely used: respect. The Allies listened, analyzed, and soon agreed. This was the most formidable tank in Europe. Even in defeat, German design seemed untouchable. At home, engineers and officers took pride in what they had built. The Panther was not merely a weapon, it was a statement, the culmination of everything German industry believed about precision, power, and perfection. Its designers at MAN and Daimler-Benz saw it as the purest expression of mechanical supremacy, fast, elegant, and deadly. Each tank was crafted like a piece of engineering art, its tolerances measured to the micron, its systems refined beyond anything the Allies could match. To Allied tank crews, its silhouette, long gun, low hull, and sloped armor, became an image of dread. They called it the cat. Facing it in a Sherman or a Cromwell felt like dueling a lion with a knife. American intelligence warned that frontal engagements were suicide. British analysts noted that no existing Allied weapon can reliably penetrate its glacis. The numbers confirmed what every tanker already felt. The Panther was invincible. Across the front lines, its legend grew with every engagement, every destroyed platoon, every burned-out Soviet hull. German tankers began to believe their own myth, that no Allied shell could harm them, that their armor was untouchable. It was mechanical perfection, forged in arrogance, reinforced by fear. But what no one yet realized was that perfection carries its own weakness. The moment it meets a weapon designed not to match it, but to undo it. In 1943, as German armor grew deadlier and more sophisticated, American engineers searched for an answer. The Sherman's 75mm gun, once adequate against Panzer III and Afir models, now felt obsolete. A new weapon was introduced, the 76-meter M1 cannon, longer, faster, and theoretically more powerful. It was meant to close the gap between Allied practicality and German perfection. But on the proving grounds, and later on the battlefields, its promise fell short. Tests showed only modest improvement. At close range, it could crack the side of a Panther, but against its sloped front glacis, the rounds deflected harmlessly. Armor-piercing shells that had once torn through lesser tanks now left shallow scars on steel the Americans had barely seen before. Crews in training expressed quiet frustration. By the time they reached combat, that frustration turned to fear. When the Normandy campaign began, confidence in the new gun collapsed almost as quickly as it had arrived. Reports from the front were grim and repetitive. Panthers shrug off our rounds. We can't kill them before they kill us. Tank platoons learn to survive by improvisation, flanking, ambushing, and aiming for mechanical weak points. But each tactic came at a price. A single miscalculation meant a tank lost, a crew gone. Inside the ordnance department, the atmosphere grew tense. Engineers pored over impact data, armor angles, and projectile failures. The problem was no longer the gun, but the physics itself. Conventional steel shot could not deliver the energy needed to break through modern armor. The equation was simple and unforgiving. Mass times velocity, both limited by what the Sherman's gun could bear. And so, the search turned inward, toward the material itself. What if the solution was not a bigger gun, but a denser projectile, something smaller, faster, and harder than steel? In the laboratories of Picatinny Arsenal, that question began to take shape as a radical concept. High-density, high-velocity ammunition, a shell that would not crush against armor, but pierce it like a needle through glass. It was a daring idea, born from necessity, and one that would soon change the nature of tank warfare. In the quiet of those laboratories, the engineers were designing more than a new round. They were building the weapon that would end the myth of invincibility. In the laboratories of Picatinny Arsenal, New Jersey, the sound of the war was not gunfire, but the hum of machinery, the hiss of furnaces, and the quiet rhythm of calculation. Here, far from the mud and smoke of France, a handful of engineers worked on a problem no battlefield could solve: how to give a modest 76mm gun the power to pierce the most feared armor in Europe. The answer would not come from size, but from substance. The team began to experiment with an unfamiliar material, tungsten carbide. Harder than steel, denser than lead, and capable of holding its shape under unimaginable stress. The concept was simple in theory, revolutionary in practice. Build a smaller, heavier core, and drive it faster than any ordinary round could survive. Velocity, not caliber, would do the killing. They called it High Velocity Armor Piercing, HVAP. Officially, it was designated M93. Unofficially, it was known as the Silver Bullet. The design looked almost fragile, a lightweight aluminum casing cradling a tungsten dart no wider than a thumb. When fired, the outer shell, the sabot, would peel away mid-flight, leaving only the core to continue toward its target at over 3,400 feet per second. On the proving range, the first tests stunned even its creators. Against hardened steel, the HVAP didn't deform or ricochet. It sliced clean through. At close range, it could penetrate 200 millimeters of armor, more than double the performance of conventional rounds. The engineers watched in silence as a 76mm gun, once dismissed as inadequate, now punched holes through plates designed to resist the 88mm Tiger cannon. But innovation came with its own price. Tungsten was rare, a strategic metal mined in small quantities in Burma, China, and Bolivia. Every shell consumed precious material needed for cutting tools, aircraft engines, and armor production. America's industrial machine could build tanks by the thousands, but it could not build tungsten. Realizing its scarcity, the Ordnance Department placed HVAP under strict control. Production would remain small, distribution limited. Only elite armored units on the front lines, the ones most likely to face German heavy tanks, would receive them. Even then, a Sherman might carry only a handful of HVAP rounds, each one worth its weight in silver, each one a final resort. The engineers knew they had built something extraordinary, a weapon ahead of its time, born from desperation, tempered by science. Yet even they could not predict the quiet revolution it would bring. For now, the M93 remained a secret buried in the crates of outbound convoys, waiting to cross the Atlantic, waiting to change the balance of armored warfare. By mid-1944, the battle for France had become a contest of endurance and invention. The Allies had broken through the beaches of Normandy, but beyond the hedgerows lay a new kind of war, one dominated by German armor. Everywhere the Panther appeared, it dictated the terms of engagement. Its 75mm gun could kill a Sherman at a mile. Its sloped armor, forged from Germany's last reserves of high-grade steel, could shrug off anything the Americans sent back. It was, by all logic, an unwinnable duel. In Washington, crates of the new tungsten-cored ammunition were being loaded onto ships under armed guard. Each box contained shells so valuable that their manifests were classified. But the war in Europe moved faster than the bureaucracy that sustained it. Convoys delayed by storms, ports jammed with fuel and rations. By the time HVAP reached France, the men who needed it most were already fighting without it. In the fields and villages of Normandy, Sherman crews learned to adapt. They fired standard armor-piercing rounds at the Panther's sides, or aimed for its vulnerable lower plate. They used smoke to blind its optics and maneuver for a flanking shot. Their survival depended not on superiority, but on improvisation. Tank commanders began to speak of duels as chess matches. Whoever moved first, died first. Then, in late summer, whispers began to circulate through the armored divisions. A few platoons had received a new kind of ammunition, short, stubby, capped with a faint black sheen. It looked ordinary until it fired. Crews claimed that one shot could burn through a Panther's front plate. Reports came in from scattered fronts. 76mm HVAP, one hit, one kill. Officers dismissed it at first as rumor, as the kind of miracle soldiers invent to steady their nerves. But the data began to align. The impossible was happening. Commanders started sending urgent cables to ordnance depots. Request maximum allotment of M93 HVAP, priority, frontline units. Yet the requests ran into the same immovable wall: tungsten. America had the factories, but not the metal. What existed came in small shipments from Chinese and Burmese mines, their output dwarfed by the demands of the wider war. Every shell produced meant fewer machine tools, fewer cutting edges for aircraft engines, fewer armor bits for naval guns. The engineers had created a weapon that could win the battle, but perhaps not the war. By autumn, the new round had taken on a life of its own among the tankers. They called it the Silver Bullet. Crews carried their few HVAP shells like treasure, saving them for the day they might face a Panther head-on. Some marked them with chalk crosses or nicknames, as if superstition could stretch their numbers. In a world measured by tons of armor and barrels of fuel, this weapon was measured by scarcity and faith. Each time a Sherman commander loaded one, he knew he held something extraordinary, a fragment of science distilled into survival. The enemy still had the stronger tanks, but for the first time, strength was no longer the same as certainty. Across the Atlantic, engineers worked through the night, calculating how many more of these rounds they could produce before the tungsten ran out. The clock was ticking, and so was the myth of the invincible Panther. By the autumn of 1944, the high-velocity armor-piercing round had arrived on the battlefield, but only just. Crates marked M93 were unloaded in small numbers, each one containing weapons too precious to waste. In ordnance meetings across France and England, officers argued over who should receive them. A platoon might be allotted 5 rounds, a single tank 2 or 3. To distribute them widely risked running out entirely. To hoard them meant denying the men who needed them most. The decision was made: priority to the frontline units facing Panthers. But even among those chosen, the shells were treated less like ammunition and more like currency. Tank commanders logged each one issued, each one fired. Some wrote initials on the steel cases, as if to give them identity before they vanished into battle. Every shot had to count. Training manuals were rewritten almost overnight. Crews were taught not only where to aim, but how to think. They memorized the Panther's anatomy, the weak mantlet edge where the turret curved, the ring where gun met hull, the vulnerable lower plate often hidden by mud. These were no longer just targets. They were mathematical vulnerabilities, places where the physics of tungsten might outweigh the legend of German armor. On the proving grounds in England, the numbers were astonishing. When fired, the M93 left the barrel at over 3,400 feet per second, faster than any field gun of its class. At impact, it behaved unlike any projectile seen before. It didn't shatter or deform. It simply punched through, its tungsten heart carrying its momentum straight through plate and crew alike. To the engineers who watched, it was not destruction they saw, but precision, mechanical truth made visible. At first, the Germans refused to believe such a weapon existed. Frontline reports of Panthers destroyed frontally were dismissed as exaggeration or luck. German officers called it propaganda, a morale trick, but the evidence grew too large to ignore. On a captured battlefield near Lorraine, fragments of an unfamiliar round were recovered from a destroyed Panther. Analysis revealed a hardened tungsten core, something the Germans themselves called Kernmunition, core ammunition. The results alarmed them. Internal memos from Berlin described the new shell with uncharacteristic restraint. Their penetration exceeds expectations. It was a quiet admission of fear. For the first time since the Panther's debut, German designers began to doubt their own armor. In the workshops of Henschel and Mahn, engineers studied these reports in uneasy silence. They had spent years perfecting armor geometry, calculating slopes, angles, and alloy strengths. But against velocity, against the fundamental simplicity of a tungsten dart, those calculations began to feel irrelevant. The Panther's advantage had always been balance, power, mobility, and protection in harmony. Now, one of those pillars was crumbling. As the reports reached higher levels of command, questions followed. How many of these rounds did the Americans possess? How widely were they issued? The truth was unknown, and that uncertainty was worse than knowledge. The Germans, once confident in their superiority, began to feel hunted by something they could not quantify. In laboratories across the Reich, their own experiments with tungsten-cord ammunition were revived, but it was too late. Supplies were gone, the factories fractured, the ore lines severed. For every day the Allies advanced, Germany fell another step behind the science it once led. The engineers who had built the Panther's armor now faced a weapon that rendered their mastery obsolete. And on the fog-covered plains of Lorraine, that realization was about to meet them in fire. Lorraine, September 1944. The summer heat has broken into fog and rain. In the rolling farmlands near Aracourt, the fields are thick with mud, the kind that swallows boots and tracks alike. The U.S. 4th Armored Division digs in along low ridges and hedgerows, waiting for an attack they know will come. Their Shermans, damp and cold, rest beneath camouflage nets streaked with dew. Engines idle quietly, exhausts whispering in the mist. At dawn, the sound arrives, distant, rhythmic, metallic. Panthers, dozens of them. Their heavy treads grind the soaked earth, the fog hiding their advance like a curtain. German tank commanders believe the Americans are retreating, scattered and uncoordinated, after the long pursuit across France. They drive forward with confidence born of habit, of 100 victories where the first shot always belonged to them. But the battlefield has changed. Hidden among the trees and folds of ground, the Shermans wait with their guns already trained. They have learned the rhythm of German assault, the moments between engine bursts, the pauses before contact. They have learned patience, and now, in their ready racks, they carry something new. A handful of black-tipped shells, smooth and dense, stamped with 3 letters, HVAP. The fog thins just enough for silhouettes to form. A Panther emerges at 800 meters, its turret sweeping left, searching for shapes in the mist. A Sherman gunner exhales slowly, adjusts for range, and squeezes the trigger. The flash is blinding. The shell leaves the barrel at over 3,400 feet per second, faster than sound, faster than belief. A heartbeat later, the Panther's frontal armor blossoms in flame. The shot has punched straight through, igniting fuel and ammunition in a single perfect line of force. The German crew never fires back. Across the field, more Panthers press forward, unaware that the first has already died. Another Sherman opens fire from concealment, then another. The fog becomes a canvas for burning silhouettes. For the first time, American tankers watch German armor burn before it can turn its gun. What had been unthinkable for years, a frontal kill against a Panther, has become reality. The reports that evening are surreal. Crews describe instant penetration, one-shot kills, no ricochet. Commanders confirm it in disbelief. The once invincible Panthers had fallen to the very tanks they had scorned as inferior. German after-action reports echo the confusion. Mysterious armor-piercing shells, frontal penetration at short range, unknown composition. Intelligence officers in Berlin order samples recovered and analyzed. They find only slivers of tungsten and the faint trace of a new idea. For the men of the 4th Armored Division, Aracourt becomes more than a victory. It becomes a revelation. For months they had fought as underdogs, their skill measured by how long they could survive in machines, outclassed by the enemy. Now, for the first time, they feel the balance shift. When the next Panther appears, they do not flinch. They aim, fire, and watch confidence replace fear. The German crews, meanwhile, are left to face the impossible. Armor that fails, legends that burn. Many never even see their attackers. The fog hides both sides, leaving only sound and fire. The battlefield becomes a lesson written in smoke. That superiority is not eternal. That innovation does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes quietly, in a small black shell, carried by soldiers who never expected it to work. When the fog finally lifts over Lorraine, the fields are littered with the wrecks of 45 German tanks. The American losses, fewer than 10. Aricourt is not celebrated as a grand victory. There are no parades, no headlines. But in that silence lies something greater, a change in the very physics of war. In the days to come, word of the battle will spread through the armored divisions, of Shermans that faced Panthers and lived, of a secret round that turned balance into belief. The war of fear is ending, and a new kind of confidence is beginning to rise from the smoke. In the weeks that followed Aricourt, the reports began to multiply. From the bocage of France to the flatlands of Belgium, field dispatches carried the same, almost unbelievable message: Panthers destroyed, frontally. Commanders reading the reports twice, sometimes 3 times, before accepting what they saw. The tank once thought impervious was dying in open battle. The Germans, who had ruled the armored war through fear and reputation, were beginning to lose both. At first, the accounts were scattered. A platoon in Belgium, claiming 3 kills in a single engagement. A company in Holland, reporting a Panther destroyed at 900 yards. But as they mounted, patterns emerged. Crews described the same sound: a sharper crack, a flash of blue light, and the sight of the great German cats suddenly burning from within. It wasn't luck, it wasn't flanking, it was penetration, straight through the armor that had defined a generation of tank design. For German soldiers, the shock was psychological before it was tactical. Across the front, tank crews who had once laughed at the Sherman began to whisper that something had changed. Reports from Panther battalions spoke of special American shells that tore through armor once thought invincible. "Shermans now kill us like the Russians once did," one officer wrote bitterly. The aura of technical superiority that had carried the Wehrmacht for years began to fracture under the weight of quiet, undeniable proof. Back in Germany, engineers pored over the wrecks of Panthers retrieved from the field. Each one told the same story: clean perforations through the glacis, holes too small and precise to be caused by standard shells. They re-examined the metallurgy, the slope of the plates, even the welding seams, searching for flaws that might explain the impossible. None were found. The armor had not failed. It had been outmatched. Design offices grew tense. Debates flared between manufacturers, MAN, Henschel, Daimler-Benz, over whether to thicken armor or change its composition entirely. But every improvement demanded more steel, more weight, more time, all of which Germany no longer had. The perfect balance of the Panther, power, speed, and protection, began to crumble under its own success. Perfection had met reality, and reality was winning. Meanwhile, the Allies remained quiet. No official communiques, no public boasting. The existence of the HVAP round remained classified even among many frontline units. The fewer who knew, the better. Secrecy was its own advantage. The Germans would continue to fight in uncertainty, never sure whether the next Sherman they faced carried the weapon that could destroy them. But on the battlefield, the silence spoke louder than any announcement. American crews, who had once counted themselves lucky to survive an encounter with a Panther, now began to fight back with confidence. They moved faster, engaged bolder, and no longer saw the enemy's silhouette as a death sentence. The balance of fear, that invisible weight that governed every armored duel, had shifted. In this new war of attrition, innovation was no longer measured by design elegance, but by adaptability. Germany had perfected the machine. America had perfected the method. The HVAP round was not simply a better shell, it was the embodiment of industrial pragmatism, a weapon born of physics and supply chains rather than heroism. It represented a truth that was beginning to define the war. Brilliance could win battles, but only practicality could win wars. As the front lines pushed east, the Panther's legend persisted, but it was no longer unchallenged. Tankers on both sides now understood that invincibility was an illusion, one that could vanish with a single shot. For the first time since 1943, the field of armored warfare was even. The German engineers, still clinging to the ideal of mechanical supremacy, were about to face a revelation far colder than steel, that in the age of total war, perfection was not strength, it was fragility. To understand why the Panther began to fall, one must look not to the battlefield, but to the laboratory. The weapon that cracked its armor was not a triumph of size or firepower, but of physics, a redefinition of how energy could be used to defeat steel. At its heart was tungsten, a metal so dense that a piece the size of a thumb weighed more than a cartridge of steel. When shaped into a slender core and hurled at impossible velocity, it did something ordinary shells could not. It didn't rely on brute impact to crush armor, it cut through it with focus. The high-velocity armor. Piercing round was not a hammer, it was a scalpel. The secret lay in its anatomy. The outer shell, made of lightweight aluminum, acted as a carrier, the sabot, designed to fall away in mid-flight. Freed from that burden, the tungsten dart continued toward its target, maintaining both speed and stability. What followed on impact was not blunt trauma, but something far more violent, armor shear. Instead of bending or crumpling, the plate fractured, layers of metal separating along microscopic grains. It wasn't pierced, it was split apart. To German engineers accustomed to thinking in terms of thickness and slope, this was heresy. Their entire design philosophy rested on resistance, that armor could absorb or deflect energy. But the HVAP didn't respect resistance, it ignored it. Its density multiplied the energy on contact, converting motion into a fine point of destruction that no thickness could fully stop. Against sloped plates, the tungsten core did not glance away. It gripped, bit, and burrowed in. The very geometry that had once made the Panther untouchable now became its weakness. Captured fragments of the new ammunition soon reached German research centers. Metallurgists at Kummersdorf examined the remains under magnification. They found traces of tungsten carbide, bonded so tightly it had not even deformed on impact. The reports carried a note of reluctant admiration. Hartkern munition, core ammunition, American origin, extremely efficient. For the scientists who studied it, the revelation was bitter. Germany had experimented with similar technology before the war. Their own tungsten-cored rounds, Panzergranate 40, had achieved remarkable results in early trials. But by 1943, the projects had withered under the pressure of scarcity. The Reich simply did not have the tungsten. The small quantities mined in Austria and Portugal were already consumed by the demands of machine tools and armor production. Without it, even the most advanced research remained theoretical. In contrast, the Allied effort was industrial in scale. American engineers could draw from the combined resources of global trade, from the tungsten mines of Burma and China to refineries in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Every HVAP round represented a network of industry stretching across oceans, fed by ships, labor, and logistics. It was not just science that fired from a Sherman's barrel. It was the sum of an economy that dwarfed anything Germany could match. Within German ordnance circles, the realization was devastating. They could design stronger armor, but not enough of it. They could build more tanks, but not fast enough. The Panther had begun as a weapon of intellect, the perfect marriage of engineering and warfare. But it was meeting an enemy that thought differently. America's innovation did not lie in refinement, but in execution. Their genius was not precision, it was abundance. The lesson was harsh and mathematical. For every tungsten dart that left an Allied gun, the physics of German armor became a little less relevant. The Panther's supremacy was not undone by a larger gun or thicker steel, but by a deeper understanding of materials and a nation that could afford to apply it. By the winter of 1944, the shock had settled in. German engineers no longer spoke of invincibility. They spoke of endurance, of how long before the balance of science, supply, and momentum made resistance futile. In the end, it was not the shell alone that defeated the Panther. It was the realization behind it, that in modern war, physics had become strategy, and strategy had become science. By the end of 1944, Germany's tanks were still formidable, but the nation that built them was no longer the same. The Reich's foundries burned under Allied bombing, its railways lay twisted and silent, and its supply lines stretched past breaking. The machines that had once embodied perfection were now born from scarcity. Even the mighty Panther, symbol of mechanical dominance, began to feel the slow decay of a nation running out of everything that made its genius possible. Steel, once plentiful and pure, arrived at the factories in poor quality. The alloys that gave armor its hardness were diluted with substitutes, their consistency unreliable. Armor plates cracked during welding. Gearboxes failed under stress. Each new tank that left the assembly line was a little weaker than the one before it. German engineers, once proud of their precision, now worked with compromises. For men who measured their craft in microns, the loss of control was unbearable. Tungsten, the key to high-velocity shells and cutting tools, had nearly vanished. Blockaded trade routes and Allied control of global mines meant that Germany's most advanced munitions could no longer be made. The tungsten-cored Hartkern ammunition projects that might have countered the American HVAP were quietly abandoned. Factories turned to soft steel and synthetic materials, but none could match the density or durability of the real thing. Each attempt at imitation ended in failure. What the Allies had built through abundance, the Germans could no longer replace through ingenuity. Fuel was even worse. Panthers, designed for long-range mobility, were reduced to static defenses, hidden in woods or along roads, waiting for the enemy to come to them. Their engines coughed and sputtered on ersatz gasoline that fouled filters and corroded seals. The tank that had once been the hunter of Europe was now chained to its own shortage. For every hour spent in battle, it spent 3 under repair. Within the design offices, the frustration was palpable. Engineers sent report after report to Berlin, pleading for rationality, standardize production, simplify construction, build fewer models but make them reliable. But the leadership demanded miracles instead of solutions. New prototypes, thicker armor, bigger guns, as if brilliance alone could replace the iron and fuel that no longer existed. Each new command from above only deepened the crisis below. The results were inevitable. As the Allies advanced, they captured newly built Panthers whose quality had deteriorated beyond recognition. Weld seams were uneven. Armor plates were brittle. Gearboxes failed after only a few hours of operation. A tank that had once symbolized technological supremacy was now a reflection of a collapsing system, a masterpiece undone by exhaustion. At the same time, across the Channel, the Allied factories roared without pause. American and British foundries poured out tanks, guns, and ammunition in numbers that defied imagination. The HVAP round, once scarce and experimental, now arrived in steady shipments, its production secured by global logistics that Germany could no longer touch. The contrast was absolute. Where one side refined its weapons into art, the other turned war into an equation and solved it with numbers. For the German engineers, it was a tragedy of recognition. They had built machines for victory, but their nation could no longer support the precision they required. Perfection, they realized, was not just a philosophy, it was a luxury, and luxuries die first in total war. The Panther's myth had been forged in brilliance, but its downfall came from mathematics. By the winter of 1945, even those who had once worshipped the perfection of German design began to see the truth. The armor that was meant to shield them cracked from within. The factories that once birthed miracles now produced ghosts. In the end, the Panther's fall was not the failure of a tank. It was the failure of a system that had believed perfection could outlast exhaustion. And as the fires burned across the Reich, the engineers who had built for eternity faced the quiet, inescapable reality of limitation. By late 1944, the front lines of Europe stretched like a scar across the continent. But the true battle was no longer fought there. The contest had shifted far from the guns and the mud into the humming factories and endless shipping yards that fed the machines of war. In these unseen arenas, victory was no longer measured in kills or ground gained, but in the tonnage of steel, fuel, and tungsten moved across oceans. America understood this better than anyone. The HVAP round, that small, unassuming dart of tungsten carbide, was not just a weapon. It was a miracle of coordination. Each one carried within it the effort of nations, the labor of miners, the precision of machinists, and the patience of strategists. From the mountains of Burma to the mills of Pennsylvania, an invisible network pulsed with the energy of a country that had turned its entire industry into an arsenal. When engineers at Picatinny Arsenal requested more tungsten for ammunition, Washington listened. Machine tools could wait. The cutting edges that once built locomotives and lathes were sacrificed to create armor-piercing cores. Mines in China and Burma, secured by Allied forces and local labor, were stripped to the bedrock. Cargo ships crossed submarine-infested waters carrying the precious metal, each ton worth more than gold. It was melted, refined, shaped, and finally assembled into a cartridge no larger than a man's hand. A single HVAP round represented a logistical miracle, a weapon born of geography and economics as much as engineering. Meanwhile, German command watched their reserves dwindle. They had no Burma, no Atlantic convoys, no industrial partner across the sea. Their tungsten came from Portugal and a few occupied deposits in Central Europe, sources shrinking by the week under Allied blockade. The same material they needed for precision tools, for cutting armor plate and manufacturing optics, was now being rationed with desperation. To produce more tanks, they needed tungsten. To fight more tanks, they needed it again. The circle was cruel and unbreakable. In the Reich's planning offices, the imbalance was clear, though few dared to say it aloud. The numbers spoke with quiet brutality. America's war production was now greater than that of all Axis nations combined. While German factories struggled to repair what bombers destroyed, the US replaced entire plants overnight. Tank engines, transmissions, and shells moved on conveyor belts that never stopped. The war of steel had become a war of supply, and supply had already chosen its victor. The HVAP round, though rare on the battlefield, came to symbolize this deeper truth. Everyone that reached the front was proof that America's strength was not in any single weapon, but in its ability to deliver it, across time zones, across oceans, across an entire world. The German engineers could design brilliance, but brilliance could not move without fuel, nor fire without metal. For the Allies, practicality had become a doctrine, and logistics a weapon as decisive as any gun. On the front lines, tank crews never saw the global machinery behind their ammunition. To them, the HVAP arrived in wooden crates, labeled simply 76 Seamim No. 93. But behind each label lay the sweat of thousands, the hum of furnaces, the ticking of assembly lines that never slept. The sound of a single tungsten dart leaving a Sherman's barrel was, in truth, the echo of an entire civilization in motion. The Germans could still build tanks, but they could no longer build time. Their resources were measured in days, their supply chains in miles of destruction. Each Panther that rolled from a shattered factory was a masterpiece surrounded by ruins, elegant yet doomed by scarcity. The war that had once been about who could design the better machine had become something far larger, who could sustain the act of war itself. America's victory was not simply a triumph of weapons, but of willpower translated into production. It was a slow victory, one built in foundries, shipyards, and train depots, one that could not be seen from the battlefield, but could be felt in its outcome. And as the tide of the war turned inexorably westward, the message became clear. Innovation had won the first battles. Industry would win the last. The Panther remained deadly, but against an enemy that could outlast it, outbuild it, and outship it, even the finest machine in the world could only delay the inevitable. The HVAP round, small, silent, and unseen, had become not just a weapon of war, but a symbol of patience, the kind of patience that wins empires. In the closing months of 1944, the crews of the Panther, once the undisputed hunters of Europe, began to whisper. Their confidence, so deeply built upon armor thickness and muzzle velocity, was faltering. In after-action reports and scattered survivor accounts, a pattern appeared, disbelief followed by silence. A tank struck from the front, a sharp metallic crack, and then fire. At first, they refused to believe it. The frontal armor of the Panther, sloped and hardened, was supposed to be invincible to anything short of an 80 ultim limit. Yet there it was, penetrated cleanly by a Sherman. The crew of one disabled tank near Nancy recalled stepping from their smoldering vehicle to see a Sherman half hidden behind hedgerows. It wasn't flanking, it hadn't ambushed, it had shot straight through them. One of the men simply murmured, "They have new shells." What followed was not panic, but erosion, slow, psychological, and irreversible. Crews began to doubt their armor. Commanders began to second-guess their positions. The Panther, once the embodiment of mechanical confidence, now carried a ghost in its turret, the thought that safety no longer existed. Veterans who had once hunted with ease now hesitated before exposing their hulls. Confidence gave way to caution. Caution gave way to fear. They called it Kern munition, core ammunition, though few understood its science. The word passed through companies like rumor, wrapped in uncertainty. Some dismissed it as luck, others as propaganda. But every burned-out wreck, every perfect hole through a glacis plate, argued otherwise. The Panthers were dying in ways they couldn't explain. In tank warfare, belief is as powerful as armor. When belief cracks, no thickness of steel can hold. By winter, Panther crews began to avoid direct duels with the Shermans they once mocked. They maneuvered for cover, fired from distance, or withdrew entirely when they saw multiple targets. The psychological shift was profound. The predator had learned to fear its prey. Even those who never faced HVAP directly felt its presence. Rumors of silver shells circulated among German armored units retreating across France and Belgium. Some claimed the Americans had developed a new explosive compound. Others blamed sabotage or flaws in their own steel. No one could prove anything, but every time a Panther burned, the myth of German invincibility burned with it. In debriefings, survivors spoke quietly, almost clinically. They described the sound, a sharper impact, a cleaner strike. They remembered the brief flicker of disbelief before the fire reached the ammunition racks. These were not men broken by fear, but by realization. The realization that they were no longer untouchable. By early 1945, the German command could no longer deny it. Their most advanced tank, their pride and propaganda centerpiece, was being undone not by a superior machine, but by a better idea. A tungsten dart smaller than a finger, born from science, economy, and persistence. What followed was not just the loss of a weapon, but the death of an illusion. The war of armor and firepower had turned inward, into the human mind. Confidence, once the greatest armor of all, had been breached. The Panther crews had once believed themselves the hunters of the modern battlefield. But in the end, they learned the cruelest truth of all, that in war it is not the strongest who endure, but those who adapt. And the myth of the unbeatable machine died quietly, somewhere in the smoke of Lorraine. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world began to take inventory, not only of lives and cities lost, but of ideas tested in fire. In the archives of Allied ordnance departments, a small collection of documents told a quiet, almost hidden story. The story of a weapon that had existed in limited numbers, yet left an outsized shadow across the war. Statistical reports revealed that only 18% of all 76mm ammunition fired in Europe had been HVAP. To the untrained eye, it seemed insignificant, a footnote in the vast scale of Allied production. But those who studied the data noticed something deeper. Wherever HVAP appeared, German losses spiked. Engagement reports shifted from frustration to confidence. Commanders who once ordered flanking maneuvers began to record frontal kills. The pattern was unmistakable. A small percentage of rounds had changed the psychology of armored warfare. In Allied testing grounds, captured Panthers were lined up for ballistic trials. Engineers examined the angles of penetration, the patterns of damage, the remnants of tungsten cores lodged deep inside steel. The findings confirmed what battlefield rumor had already declared. The M93 HVAP could pierce the Panther's frontal armor under the right conditions, something no other Allied round had achieved consistently. Numbers on paper now told the story that tank crews had lived and died to prove. Across the ruins of Germany, their own engineers conducted similar analyses. In surviving documents from Henschel and Krupp, phrases recur with quiet resignation. Hartkern Munition der Feind, the enemy's core ammunition. They noted its efficiency, its speed, and its density. One memo admitted, "We could not match it. Our reserves of tungsten are exhausted." The weapon that had once been dismissed as Allied propaganda had become a post-war obsession. But perhaps the most profound legacy of HVAP lay not in its wartime effect, but in the scientific principles it introduced. The idea of a small, dense penetrator traveling inside a discarded shell, a sabot, would evolve into the very heart of modern tank warfare. From the British APDS of the 1950s to the American APF-SDS rounds of the Cold War, every modern armor-piercing dart can trace its ancestry to that modest tungsten core fired from a Sherman's gun. Historians would later call it a turning point in design philosophy. For decades, nations had built larger tanks, heavier armor, and bigger guns. But HVAP proved that progress could also mean refinement, that a lighter projectile, properly engineered, could defeat the heaviest machine. In the language of war, intelligence had finally overtaken brute force. The Panther's downfall became more than a tactical event. It became a lesson in overconfidence. German engineers had believed that perfection in design equaled permanence in superiority. They had built machines to dominate the present, not to survive the future. The Americans, working from necessity rather than pride, had built for adaptability. In post-war lectures and reports, ordnance officers summarized it simply: "We won not by greater power, but by better use of what we had." It was a statement as much about philosophy as physics. As NATO scientists continued to refine the Dart, its lineage became a metaphor for the century that followed: smaller, faster, smarter weapons, replacing grand machines of the past. The HVAP had done more than pierce armor. It had pierced the myth that complexity guarantees victory. In the quiet of post-war laboratories, the tungsten dart rested, unremarkable to the eye, yet carrying within it the blueprint of modern warfare. It was proof that in an age of giants, it was still the smallest ideas that could change the shape of the world. In the final years of the war, the irony became impossible to ignore. Germany had led the world in design. Its tanks, aircraft, and weapons, the products of minds obsessed with perfection. Every bolt was crafted, every angle refined, every contour tested in pursuit of technical dominance. Yet, as the front collapsed and the fuel ran dry, those same qualities became chains. The very precision that had once defined their superiority now prevented them from adapting to the brutal arithmetic of modern war. America, by contrast, had never built for beauty. Its tanks were plain, its weapons unremarkable, its designs conservative. The Sherman was a workhorse, not a masterpiece. Its 70mm gun was modest by German standards, its armor functional rather than proud. Yet within this ordinariness lay a genius of a different kind, the genius of scale, repairability, and persistence. The Americans did not perfect, they produced. They did not obsess over tolerances. They learned to fight with what they had, and to improve it under fire. Though HVAP round became the embodiment of this philosophy. It was not born in a cathedral of engineering, but in a laboratory of necessity. A tungsten dart wrapped in aluminum, simple, elegant, and devastating. It did not require a new tank or a grand redesign. It merely required thought, the willingness to find a smarter way rather than a bigger one, intelligence serving simplicity. For the German engineers, this was an inversion of everything they believed. To them, excellence meant mastery, the creation of machines that could awe through their precision. But in war, machines do not exist in isolation. They live or die within a system of supply, of labor, of adaptability. The Panther, magnificent in theory, could not be built fast enough, fueled often enough, or repaired easily enough to survive. Its brilliance was real, but brittle. The Sherman, in contrast, was humble, and therefore indestructible in spirit. It could be repaired by a field crew in hours, its parts replaced by any mechanic in any corner of the world. Its HVAP ammunition arrived by convoy, produced in factories that never slept. Every time one was destroyed, another rolled off an assembly line to take its place. Superiority, it turned out, was not the art of building one perfect thing, but the discipline of making enough good ones. In this, the war revealed its quiet truth. Technological genius is only as powerful as the system that sustains it. Germany had created the future in miniature, but failed to survive the present. America, slower to learn, ended by mastering the one skill that matters most in total war: adaptation. The HVAP was more than a round of tungsten, it was a symbol of that shift. A small, unglamorous idea that rendered great machines obsolete. A fragment of metal that proved intellect could triumph without spectacle. As the smoke cleared from Europe's fields, the moral was unmistakable. Superiority had blinded those who possessed it. Innovation had humbled those who believed they no longer needed to learn. History, in the end, did not reward the flawless mind or the flawless machine. It rewarded the mind that could change. The HVAP was the whisper of that lesson, that progress without humility is just another form of defeat. In a quiet museum hall, far from the noise of factories and the thunder of battle, a single shell sits behind glass. It is small, dark, and unremarkable, a 76mm HVAP round recovered from the fields of Lorraine. Its label is plain: High-Velocity Armor-Piercing, M93, 1944. Visitors walk past it without pause, unaware that this modest piece of metal once turned the tide of an entire philosophy. Beside it stands a Panther tank. Massive, elegant, and motionless, its armor still gleams faintly under the lights, its lines as graceful as they were terrifying in war. To most who see it, the Panther remains a symbol of power, the pinnacle of German engineering. But to those who know, it represents something else: the cost of believing that perfection alone could win a war. The contrast between the two artifacts is almost poetic. One, a masterpiece of machinery; the other, a simple dart of tungsten wrapped in aluminum. The Panther was the product of an empire's genius, the HVAP the product of a democracy's pragmatism. Together they tell a story that in the end, intelligence serving simplicity proved stronger than brilliance serving pride. For the men who once faced each other across Europe's fields, this truth came too late. The German crews who laughed at the Shermans in 1943 did not laugh in 1944. By then, the battlefield had changed. Their armor, once a fortress, had become a target. Their confidence, once unshakable, had been replaced by the quiet understanding that the war had moved beyond them. The engineers who had designed the Panther, the same men who believed in the sanctity of precision, would later study the Allied HVAP and call it a perfect answer. In that phrase lies the quiet humility of defeat. They had created art. Their enemies had created endurance, and endurance in the long war of men and machines always prevails. Today the tungsten dart lies still, stripped of its velocity, its purpose, its fire. Yet in its silence, it carries a warning that outlived the war. It reminds us that the measure of power is not how complex a weapon is, but how wisely it is used. That progress without restraint becomes arrogance, and arrogance without reflection becomes ruin. The Panther remains proud, but silent. The HVAP, unremarkable, still speaks. It ended an age of arrogance and began one of adaptation. They believed armor would make them invincible, until a small tungsten dart proved them wrong.